Question?
Sure.
How many states had abolished slavery by the time the Constitution was ratified?
Well, I don't know the exact number.
9 out of 13. That's not a slave country.
Well, then you could say it was a confederacy with portions that were slave
I think
states.
that's better said. 9 out of 13 had already abolished. So there was a sunset moratorium for slavery in the Constitution.
Charlie is cooking right now. He's cooking.
What I noticed, at least in some of the classes that I took, the higher end classes, was that sometimes when you were presented ideas, they were presented not to have you agree with them, but rather to incentivize the greatest discussion. For example, I wasn't an economist, but I did learn about Karl Marx. Now, not many professors are actual Marxists, unfortunately. So when Marx was brought up in that context, it wasn't like, here's what you need to know, here's what you should believe. It was more, here are some ideas, radical and agreeable. What do you think about them? And when I look at what Kendi has written, I don't often agree with some of the more radical propositions, but I do enjoy the process. And I don't think that's something which should warrant the state intervening to cut out those discussions. I think that's a
great
brutish response.
That's a great segue, if I could go. So the next question then is, should we be teaching first and second and third graders to be hyper-conscious aware of race all the time? I think that's destructive. I think it goes against the American promise of e pluribus unum, of caring more about character than skin color. And yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was a mixed bag when it came to this stuff.
He's a cool guy.
But he was a very radical socialist in some regard, but he really hit it perfectly when he said that this was the ideal of the American system. Do you see any downsides to getting third graders caring about the color of people's skin all the time?
Well, I think depending on their environment, they might already, whether they know it or not, in very implicit and subtle ways. We know from tests done, for example, on like little kids, like 4-year-olds or whatever.
Question: when you guys were in third grade, were you thinking about critical race theory and other people's skin tones? And this is a real question. I really want to know. Because when I was in third grade, I was a really big WWE fan. I loved wrestling. John Cena was my favorite. I like Jeff Hardy too. I love cars, and I loved dressing as superheroes and play fighting with my friends and my brother. That's what I was doing when I was in the third grade. So it's just crazy to me how nowadays we have a whole set of third graders learning about critical race theory. It is crazy to me, because when I was in third grade, I was playing with toys. I was just watching WWE. And now these kids are out here getting really woke. They are liberated in third grade nowadays. Oh my gosh.
That some elements of implicit racial bias already infect their thinking. Now that isn't a moral judgment. We're all flawed beings. We live and we die. We all have biases. That is just a part of life. But I think conversations about those things can be valuable. I don't believe we live in a colorblind world, so teaching people that we do can often lead them to remain ignorant to evident problems. Now, to what extent would you be comfortable, what would you say, like bringing a racial consciousness to third graders?
For me, very little to none. As don't care about it, de-emphasize it, look at the spirit, the soul, the conduct, and the character of the human being. Their skin color means nothing. Not saying that you should start to emphasize, organize what people look like, because therefore it means something that we're going to tell you. A great example is that this is the textbook definition of stereotyping, right? Is that if you see a black person, you don't know their history. You don't know if they're the son of a Nigerian billionaire. You don't know if they're an immigrant from Turks and Caicos, and you don't know if they're the 9th generation descendant of slaves, right? There's been 2 million blacks that have come to America legally through the immigration process since 1980. So this sort of hyper-fixation on race, and I want to keep on getting back to this because I'm just curious, is do you think this is actually helpful when there actually might be stuff that 90% of the country agrees on? Do you think this actually might be a smokescreen tactic?
Well, it really depends on what's being taught. So here are some things I obviously don't want taught. One group is better than another. Of course, black people are like this, white people are like this.
That is being taught in some schools.
There are some schools that do that, and while I would look to see their curriculum mended, I just don't want to implicitly agree with like a state ban. I would see adjustments done.
But if you're teaching critical race theory in schools, I really want to know what that will look like when you teach it to a third grader or even an elementary schooler, even a middle schooler. How would that look teaching that to them? Because let's be honest, when you're that age, quite frankly, the majority just do not understand certain concepts, especially when it comes to nuance within racism or nuance within skin color or these type of conversations, majority of kids, like you've talked to third grade before. You have little brothers or little nieces and nephews or little cousins who are this age. If you were to really sit down with them and try to have a real conversation, not changing any rhetoric in how you speak, have a real conversation and explain the nuances within race or racial dynamics or affirmative action dynamics, do you honestly think a third grader can understand what you're coming from and understand and perceive everything you're trying to say? No, obviously not. This will not happen. It will literally not happen. So the fact that we're trying to sit here and pretend like teaching kids these type of concepts is ever a good idea, we are just lying to ourselves.
But there are some things that I think could be done well. For example, say you're teaching about very basic early history, you know?
This is where I wanted to get to.
Yeah, okay.
This is important.
So here are some things about America's founding that I like. One of the first practical liberal democracies, glory of the republic. Folks had nice hair back then.
Not a democracy, but a republic.
Right,
That's
well,
okay.
I mean, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. And we, of course, did more to fulfill the promise of a democracy with time. But obviously, when America was founded, it was a slave state. 1 in every 6 people in America at that time was human property.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How many states had abolished slavery by the time the Constitution was ratified?
Well, I don't know the exact number.
9 out
Did
of
I mention-
13. That's not a slave country.
Well, then you could say it was a confederacy with portions that were slave
I think
states.
that's better said. 9 out of 13 had already abolished. There was a sunset moratorium for slavery in the Constitution.
So this could...
Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. We were on the way to eradication. We were not a slave country.
Well, hold on. I mean,
and I'll add one thing.
We were on the way, but then like 80 years later, it was still happening.
So the question is why, right? That's a really important question. And
Economics.
Charlie is cooking right now. He's
Cotton
cooking.
Gin and John C. Calhoun. Happy
hold
to
on.
go through
He's
that.
cooking.
There was actually a grievance in the Declaration of Independence, specifically that the Crown had enslaved people.
The first draft.
Yeah, in the first draft from Thomas Jefferson, the Crown had enslaved people who had done nothing to offend the Crown, brought them to the states, and then were then offering them the freedom that was stolen from them to wage war against the colonists who had grievances.
It's an effective strategy. The
It
Union
is,
did it
but
too.
he-
They promised the slaves
Right.
when they moved southward. Yeah.
Jefferson took that out, and he did it because they felt, and this is according to historians, that without, I think it was South Carolina and Georgia, they would not have been able to win the Revolutionary War, and so they had to remove that,
That's exactly
hoping
right.
they would stay in. Now, the reality is, I'll just say one more point. They thought they were going to lose anyway. They really did. They didn't think they could go up against the greatest empire in the world at the time. So it's kind of unfortunate, I think. An important factor here is that I believe it was the British Empire, actually 1833 had abolished slavery in all of its territories, and it took the U.S. a little bit longer to do so. But I want to make sure I stress, this issue for the start of the country was contentious and ultimately led to violence because from the beginning, as Charlie pointed out, most of the states had already abolished this, so it was like people were ready to fight from the beginning.
Oh, I just want to
Nah, he's cooking, man. They just cooked. They're cooking right now. They're cooking, man. This is crazy.
say to that. My understanding of the founding of America isn't as simplistic as the founding fathers were evil because X or Y. I recognize, of course, that
And I appreciate that.
there are incredible complexities to those issues. And also, I'm not a historian. There are probably tons of things out there I don't even know that might change my opinion in the future. But with that being said, while I recognize there were fine-bodied, hearted, and souled Americans who recognized slavery was a moral aberration from the get-go, 1 in every 6 Americans was owned. And while that may have been constrained to some of the states, it was still ultimately under the purview of the federal government to make decisions with regards to the legality and constitutionality of that. Now, some people, they get really defensive when this conversation comes. I'm not saying you guys, but some people, they do. And I think it's because they think I'm assigning some kind of moral worth to them now, or to the country now, or making some kind of broad prescriptive statement. I'm not. The only thing I'm saying is, when you're teaching history to a bunch of kids, you know, you have to teach it all. At least you have to teach the basic pointers. And for Black Americans, the history of this country has been less than favorable. So I think that in the context of that discussion, saying, and to this day, we still have some problems with race. There are some legacies of slavery that still affect Black people, and we're working on it today. Something like that. That's a kind of racialization that I'm in favor of because it doesn't encourage stereotyping, it doesn't encourage discrimination, it just encourages a base awareness of some serious problems.
So, but that's not happening. right, is that largely what we're seeing through school districts like Chicago and in Washington, D.C., and the entire California school system, representing 10,000 schools and 6 million students.
I've seen the documents on those.
Yeah, is that it doesn't have that kind of nuance and complexity that you just presented, right?
And I think that's also a really good point. And this is why I really have a hard time saying that something is inherently wrong. And I'll never say this because I'm objective. I'm sorry. Nothing is inherently wrong with the left or the right if everything was on paper. And the reason I'm saying that is because what this guy on the left, on the other side said, the college, whatever he is, if everything was done the right way, you could teach critical race theory to children. You could teach the history, because I do believe if you're going to teach history, teach it all. If everything was done correctly, with no bias, with no, hidden motives, you can teach this to kids. You can. But the problem is that in America, it's not. And that's what Republicans or conservatives are saying. They're not saying something is inherently wrong with teaching history. They're saying their children are being brainwashed. They're saying who's ever teaching their children is obviously trying to paint a racist narrative towards their own race. Neither side is wrong. The left, or I wouldn't even say the left, but him particularly, and people who think like him are saying this concept is not bad. But what Charlie Kirk is saying, and people who would side with him, is saying, yeah, the concept itself was not bad, but the reality of the situation is these children are growing up to hate their own skin, or they're growing up to hate other people's skin, or they're growing up brainwashed. That's what's happening now.
Let me just say this, is that part of the kind of archangel triumphant of the wokeism coalition is Nicole Hannah-Jones, Robin DiAngelo, and Ibram X. Kendi. And Nicole Hannah-Jones in particular, right, the author of the 1619 Project, she heretically says that America was founded on slavery, right? And so
I'd be okay with that.
But it's just not true.
It depends on what you mean by founded on.
She defines this. She says the founding fathers were in favor of it. Not true. George Washington wasn't. John Adams wasn't. John Quincy Adams wasn't. Thomas Jefferson even signed a moratorium of new slaves coming into the United States. Ben Franklin chaired an anti-slavery convention in 1775. None of these guys were writing expositionally how wonderful slavery was.
Well, this isn't being taught to third graders, right? The 1619 Project's a little New York op-ed.
No, it's not. See, that's where you're wrong. The 1619 Project's being implemented as school district curriculum in thousands of school districts across the country.
That's true.
Well,
across the country.
It's not just like a podcast. This is curriculum.
Right, there are principles of the 1619 Project that I think are defensible. First,
Bro, so here's my problem. You initially said that it's not being taught across the country. They obviously proved you wrong and said, yes, it 100% is being taught across the country. Now you're not even going to be like, oh yeah, maybe I'm wrong. I need to look into that. That's a very easy thing to say. You're just going to double down on your already biased point of view and say, well, maybe some parts of it should be taught. What does that have to do with the obvious wrongness of teaching children that America was founded on slavery? Slavery existed in America. But to say our entire country, everything we know, the foundation of our country is pure slavery, what are you teaching young children? What benefit does that have for young children? That's a better question. When you teach a young white boy, a young white girl, or a young black boy or a young black girl that your country was founded on slavery, what does that make them believe? How does that aid them in their life? And my problem is that you could have just said, you know what, I'm wrong, I'm going to look into that. You didn't say that. You said, well, some concepts of this idea should be taught to school. Come on, man.
First of all, we as Americans tend to think of the founding of our country as its legal founding, But the legal founding of the United States didn't really mean much for a slave. I mean, it really didn't matter that much for the peasantry of the time, no matter what.
See, that's where I disagree. So when was the first state to abolish slavery? Vermont in 1777. Why?
Well, I mean,
because they were inspired by the Declaration of Independence. Things started to change in that year.
Right, but the slaves that then continued to be slaves would have been in the states that didn't make that choice, right?
He is frying him, though. He is frying him right now. He said that, well, the legal doctrine has no correlation to the founding of America or something along those lines. He said, what are you talking about? The first state to abolish slavery was inspired by the Constitution. He's cooking you right now, bro. I'm not even gonna lie.
Which were largely in southern states.
So, Well, that's what I mean. I didn't mean to miss out on the particulars there. The only point that I'm making is that depending on whose lineage you follow, depending on the narrative that you tell, this is a very postmodern idea. And I would like to consider myself charitable to postmodernism, the idea that there are many ways you can describe the human experience, which I think we all believe to some extent. Depending on who you follow, you get very different ideas on what America is, when America was founded, not in a legal sense, but in a conceptual sense, and who today holds the birthrights to which they were entitled. And these conversations should be had. They're worthwhile.
Wait, what do you mean by that? Who today holds the birthrights with which they're entitled? And this is my problem with these liberal talking points. They all are under the assumption that black people just don't have freedoms, that we don't have rights or something, that we just aren't able to live our lives. It's the weirdest thing ever. I have rights. I have rights, bro. I went to college just like everyone else. I have a job like everyone else. I have literal every single right. I've never been denied my freedom. What are you even getting at right now? It's really kind of racist, man. Like, you just think that just because I'm black or something, I wasn't born with the freedoms or something. Like, nah, man, I promise I was.
Conversations to have. I've seen some of the curriculums in these schools. I find some of them a little bit objectionable. But to be perfectly clear, I found school curriculums objectionable for ages. About half of Americans believe in the lost cause myth, the idea that the North started a civil war and it was over like states' rights or whatever. That's believed by a large number of Americans. There are textbooks put out by Pearson in Texas that have
there is
narratives
some
in them
truth
that
to
are,
that, by the way, just so we're clear.
I'm
happy to go through Civil War history.
Well, let me.
He's getting cooked, man. He's getting cooked. But if you want a part 2 to this video, please let me know, because I would love to continue this video, man. This is a good one. Miss LFR Jojo, you have any suggestions for me? Comment down below, and I'll see you guys.